Harry seems to think you are," he replied. "I got a letter from him a week ago." Cecilia nodded. "Well, I've just spent the last 4 months working with him on something very secret and specialist, so it's not surprising. In that respect," she conceded. "I have only ever met 2 other people with his intellect in my life." She looked at him earnestly. "Believe me when I say we are lucky to have him in the Order." Sirius snorted. "In that case I wish he had been on our side the first time round," he said, glancing at Cecilia. "But it doesn't matter now. We do," he added, "and soon this will be over." Sirius walked over to the door, holding it open. The music from the living room emanated into the kitchen and he smiled. "Are you feeling better?" Cecilia nodded. "Come on then," he said, beckoning her towards the living room. "I want to see what happens between Bill and Charlie. They've got a bet going with Arthur that Bertie can't drink 18 butterbeers before the end of the evening." Cecilia laughed as she followed him out of the kitchen. The room was a little more crowded now. It looked as if more people had got up to dance to the music that had just been playing, and the bustle of the atmosphere was beautiful. Just what a Christmas Eve party should be like. Cecilia turned her head just as the music changed and she saw Snape heading her way, looking between her and Sirius, and Cecilia smiled in his direction. As she did so, Sirius took her by the hand, ready to lead her onto the already filling dance floor. "Would you do me the honor of a second dance, Mrs. Frobisher?" She looked back at Sirius and then at Snape, preferring the latter of the 2 wizards were she to have a choice. As the music grew in volume, she looked at Snape, as much as to tell him this, and his pace quickened in their direction. "Actually, she began, feeling flushed at the warmth of the living room again. "Actually, I think you'll find Cecilia is my partner." "Black," Snape intoned, approaching them. "Cecilia," he added, holding out his right hand and glaring at Sirius. Cecilia felt Sirius tighten his grip and stare back, stubbornly. Cecilia swallowed, not knowing what to do. Just as she was about to turn down both offers, she saw Dumbledore behind Sirius. The introduction to the music began and Dumbledore began to speak. "Mrs. Frobisher, I trust you are feeling much better?" Cecilia nodded. "Much better," she confirmed, looking back at him firmly. "And I was wondering, Professor, if..." Dumbledore held up a hand. "And if I may say, quite the most fetching mole we have here this evening. So it would be my honor if you were to dance the next waltz with myself." "Of course," replied Snape, and Cecilia smiled, registering his left arm flinching slightly involuntarily. "I am sure I speak for both of us when I say we can wait until the next dance," he added, glaring at Sirius, who nodded stiffly. "Then, Mrs. Frobisher, shall we dance?" Cecilia took Dumbledore's hand, smiling at Sirius and Snape graciously, and sighing inwardly as her dilemma disappeared. The introduction was just coming to an end, the beat slow and steady, and she stood in position, waiting for the music to begin. And as she danced with nearly all the other wizards in the room, making polite conversation with the head of the Order of the Phoenix, one amongst many of his titles, Cecilia felt herself relax, the feeling of dancing slowly with Dumbledore as he led her smoothly and lightly around the dance floor. And as they danced, Snape took up his drink again, watching her move elegantly and beautifully from his position near the door, trying to forget about the stinging irritation building up on his arm. As Dumbledore turned them so she was facing his way, Severus Snape had to keep himself from tearing back onto the dance floor and taking her back in his arms as Cecilia Frobisher smiled in his direction. But not in his direction. A few feet away stood Lupin, and he returned the smile, which was obviously meant for him. "And I really didn't think you were the mole's type," hissed Sirius Black, his voice coming from his right shoulder. "Dare I ask why your left arm is twitching so absently, Professor Snape? Perhaps you have a ring in your pocket that you can't wait to pull out. Snape turned angrily and faced a sneering Sirius. "No!" exclaimed Snape, defensively. Then why did you make an appearance with her here tonight, Snape, other than the obvious? Sirius grinned wider, delighting in the discomfort he was inflicting on his old adversary. It was an attempt to ensure I still would have a work colleague following your little soiree, Black. He looked at Sirius, his retribution beginning to grow. And to protect her from your womanizing ways. I know of your little liaison in October, very neat. Even if I do say so myself. Even I would not have been able to come up with a plan as devious as yours, Black, not even I. Snape sneered, and this time it was Sirius's turn to look taken aback. And I of yours, and if you stop me, Snivellus, I will tell her. Or at least, allow her to conveniently find out. You wouldn't dare risk. Snape put a hand inside his robe, backing Sirius underneath the stairs, into the deeper shadows. And then who would she turn to, Snivellus? Tell me that. It can't be too long until you need to leave to get to the other party you need to attend this evening. Sirius looked at Snape as he lowered his wand, rubbing his left forearm. Snape followed his gaze, then looked back at Dumbledore and Cecilia, as they continued into the second stanza of the waltz. And I expect the evenings of the two of you working ever so hard into the early hours at Hogwarts won't be half so cozy once the Mole is fully aware of what you have in store for her. Sirius stopped, grinning again as Snape thrust his right arm across his chest, trying hard not to wince at the obvious pain he was in. That is not the case. Cecilia will be perfectly safe, as well you know, replied Snape, grimacing through gritted teeth. Really, Snivellus? You do surprise me. Perhaps when I tell her, and she has allowed me to console her in my own special way. He smirked as Snape made to take a step towards him, stopping short of Sirius and grasping his left arm again. I can see to it that she is restored to her own insular little world without the weight of all of this on her mind. I will not permit it, gasped Snape, the pain so intense now that he couldn't hide it in his voice. If she goes, we will never be free of the Dark Lord. And your beloved godson will be ever in fear of his life. Snape exhaled, the pain creeping its way up to the shoulder, and took a step back when he realized that Lupin's attention had been caught by their exchange. Wizards have died. Sirius took a step forward into the space Snape had stood, hissing the words towards his adversary. Good wizards, to save her. That mole there. He stabbed the air in the direction of the dance floor. So unless you wish me to reveal all to my party guests now, Snivellus. He took another step, and Snape stepped back again, towards the door. I suggest you leave my house now. He poked his finger in the direction of the hall door now, and attend to your other business. Sirius smirked with triumph as Snape looked at Cecilia again, and turning towards the door. Dumbledore will hear of this, he hissed, as Sirius continued to grin. Everything okay? Asked Remus, who had approached them when he had overheard hushed, angry voices. Perhaps, Lupin, I might trouble you to look after Mrs. Frobisher? I am unavoidably required elsewhere. Snape gripped his arm, and Remus nodded briefly and, as the music drew to a close, he watched Snape wrench the door open and slam it behind it. He looked at Sirius, who was still grinning and who grinned wider still as they heard a crack in the hall, which Remus presumed was the Snape leaving the party. And what was that all about? Said Remus, folding his arms. And, have you been on the spirits, Padfoot? He added rebukefully as a waft of hot whiskey emanated across from his friend. Sirius patted him on the shoulder. Just getting rid of unwanted guests. Relax, Moony. I've only had one glass, he added, looking past Remus as he saw his cousin approaching now the dance was over. Look, I think old Tunks is looking for you, he added, changing the subject and gesturing towards his cousin. Remus nodded at Sirius and smiled politely at Tunks. Ready? She asked, looking at Remus. A talk, you said, just now, she prompted. When she met the look of confusion on his face and it changed to an expression of comprehension and he gestured towards the door. "Ah," said Sirius, tapping his nose, "private. But if Snivellus is still out there, tell him to clear off." Tunks looked questioningly at Remus as she stepped through the door he had opened and he gave her an "I'll explain later" look. And Cecilia smiled at the wonderfully magical, that was an appropriate adjective to use for her waltz with Dumbledore, magical dance. He had spoken softly to her as stepped it out, wishing her a peaceful few days at home, and as they danced Cecilia was overcome with the feeling that everything was now right with the world. Only when the dance had finished and she had graciously curtsied as Dumbledore bowed, not quite everything was as right as her mind suggested. For one thing, Tunks had come through the adjoining door as the music stopped and gone through to the hall with Remus. They were clearly in a hurry, but, by the look on Tunks's face, she seemed anything but happy. Cecilia excused herself from Dumbledore's company and looked around for Snape too, who had been standing near the door too, but she couldn't see him. Smiling graciously at the other wizards she passed on her way towards the door. She noticed Sirius smiling in her direction. "How was the dance?" he asked, as she came nearer. "You seem to be quite at home with our chief out there," he added, putting a hand on her shoulder. Cecilia ignored the shiver that his touch induced, looking round then back at Sirius. "Have you seen Severus around? I thought I saw him over here with you when I was dancing." "Gone," replied Sirius, continuing to smile and not removing his hand. "He had an urgent appointment to keep." "Appointment? With?" Sirius leaned towards Cecilia, hot breath on her neck, rubbing his left arm in imitation. "You know who. I assumed he would have told you he'd have to leave tonight." Cecilia shook her head, as did Sirius. "If it had been me, nothing would have come between me and the beautiful woman I'd invited to a party," he continued. Just then, the door swung open between them. Cecilia stepped back from Sirius as Tunks strode between them. She looked at Cecilia, who gasped when she saw the young witch had tears in her eyes. As Tunks took a few steps, she followed her, shrugging off Sirius as she went. "Tunks?" she asked, as they passed through groups of wizards, standing and sitting, chatting merrily as the background music continued to play softly. Tunks got as far as the stairs before she acknowledged Cecilia was there. "Not here," she whispered, leaning over the banister and looking around the living room. Cecilia looked too, and though one or two of them had noticed them pass, no one was paying a great deal of attention to Tunks. "Upstairs," she added, and made her way upstairs, her gait slow and unsteady. As she followed, Cecilia looked back at the wizards again, looking for Remus. What had he said to her to make her feel so upset? Tunks pushed open her bedroom door, at the end of the first floor, flopping onto her bed. Cecilia followed her in and sat on her own, looking at her with increasing sadness. Eventually, when she could bear the candlelight flickering off Tunks's dull grey hair no longer, she spoke. "Sometimes it's easier to talk about it. Though you don't need to tell me anything if you don't want to. We can just stay here." Tunks didn't move, but her breathing became slower and more regular, as if she was trying to hold on to her temper. Eventually she turned, and sat upright, and Cecilia was shocked to see her usual jolly and carefree eyes red and sore. "You look beautiful, Cecilia," she said eventually. "That dress looks gorgeous on you, and it's not just me that thinks it." She smiled encouragingly as Cecilia bowed her head bashfully. "Well, without your help, and Hermione's dash." "Oh come on," said Tunks, getting to her feet, her hair changing colors as she spoke. "You're stunning. I've never seen a room full of wizards go as quiet as when you and Snape walked in this evening. And Sirius hasn't been able to take his eyes off you all evening." She stopped and Cecilia realized she had got to her feet. She looked at Tunks, then looked away, feeling a blush creep onto her face. "Yes, well, your cousin, Cecilia said, trying to sound dismissive. I didn't come here dressed like this for his benefit. But you do like him, prompted Tunks, earnestly. I can see he likes you. I've never seen him dance like that with anyone before, and why? You seemed so contented and happy with him. And after what you told me that happened between you before. Tunks, said Cecilia, fighting to remain calm. What happened with Remus? Would you like to tell me about it? She looked at Tunks, who sank onto Cecilia's bed, and Cecilia felt a wave of compassion as tears began to flow down her cheeks and onto her purple dress, making the fabric damp in places. Cecilia sat next to her, and took her hand, fighting her mind's urge to speculate, because speculation would lead to thoughts of. Time passed and the tears stopped eventually. Tunks looked up childlike at Cecilia, wiping her tears away, and Cecilia tried to fix her mind on the music coming up from downstairs rather than what it was Tunks was about to tell her. Remus wanted to talk to me. He seemed different, Cecilia. He was different to the Remus I know. Different? Vague. Unclear. Aloof. Her cried-out eyes shimmered, and Cecilia leaned towards Tunks, hugging her comfortingly. Before he had a chance to tell me, I told him. Tunks got to her feet and began to pace before Cecilia. I told him I didn't want to be with him. I turned Remus down, Cecilia. She looked earnestly at Cecilia before continuing. I told him I don't want to marry him. I know there's someone else in his heart. I told him that. And he couldn't deny it to my face. Cecilia felt her heart lurch as her friend spoke, plunging towards her stomach. Lily, clarified Tunks, tears beginning again. He still loves Lily. And because of that, he couldn't propose to me. She looked at Cecilia again. And because he is such a lovely man, he couldn't tell me either. Sitting down next to her, Tunks began to cry again, and her pink hair began to change color again, flitting through various hues before blurring to the dull gray tone. So, before he had a chance to tell you he wanted to marry you, and was tongue-tied, by the sounds of it, you made an assumption, and wouldn't let him speak? Cecilia spoke kindly and softly, as if to a teenager. You presume he still loves Lily? Tunks nodded, as tears continued to fall. But he wants to marry you, Tunks. You've been together Not officially, but together for years, Cecilia continued evenly. Why are you doubting your own heart? I'm not, replied Tunks, sharply, but, she stopped, looking at Cecilia with a wave of realization on her face. But he hesitated. I didn't want to make it hard for him. She looked at Cecilia earnestly. Anyone can see how much you care for one another, continued Cecilia, hugging the young witch to herself by the shoulder, comfortingly. I've never seen two people so suited. That's what everyone says, Tunks said, nodding in agreement. Do you mind if I ask you something, Tunks? No. Cecilia, of course you can. What are you scared of? Tunks looked at Cecilia, confused. I don't know what you mean. She began, then looked back at Cecilia, realization passing over her face like a wave. I've waited so long for this. I just didn't want him not to ask me. I built it up so much in my mind that I got worked up. But, what if my feelings have changed? And what if his have too? Oh gods. She paused, staring back at Cecilia, some inner turmoil becalmed. What have I done? This is such a mess. Tunks held her head in her hands, shaking it from side to side. Thank you. She looked at Cecilia, sorry. She got to her feet, almost knocking off the oil lamp from its hook by the window as she turned. Thank you. I don't know what came over me. Cecilia smiled kindly for what felt like the 80th time during their conversation, trying to stop her feelings of no. Stop. You mustn't think about that, not now, of all times, not with what Tunks had told her. It's this war. This horrible war that's affected our lives. The fact that we don't know where we are from one day to the next. I'm just so worried that each time I see him it might be the last time I ever see him. If I don't come back, or if he... Tunks's voice trailed off, the confusion seemingly confusing her. Now, what would you have said if he had have proposed, Tunks? Said Cecilia. I don't know. Yes, I suppose. But then, I'm sure that would have been wrong, even though everyone expects it. It's not like I don't love him, and it wouldn't be wrong then. She looked at Cecilia wide-eyed. Oh, Cecilia, I feel so confused. I never let him get a word in edgeways and now I'll never know. I think you should wait here a bit, said Cecilia, patting Tunks's shoulder. I think you've got yourself worked up over nothing. Tunks nodded. Do you feel better? Tunks nodded again, and smiled gratefully at Cecilia. I'm so glad you're stopping here tonight, Cecilia. Look, Krecher even brought up your bags. She took a few steps towards Cecilia's luggage, her own problems seemingly forgotten quickly, or at least put firmly to one side. So you're planning on just a quiet break at home then, are you? No, certainly not. I've got far too much to think of for when I come back. Too many avenues to explore and not enough pairs of shoes. What? You're still doing research? Tunks turned to her in astonishment. I thought you'd finished now you've got the universal connection. Cecilia exhaled, considering how to put it. I have, said Cecilia. The evidence fits, as does everything we've done so far. It's not that. She brushed aside the long folds of her dress and bent towards the second of her bags, taking out her most recent notebook and looking between it and Tunks. It's just so novel, this work. I just have to be sure. Cecilia tossed the open book onto her own bed. I'll stop when I've checked everything. No stone unturned. Just to be sure. I wish I were as dedicated as you, said Tunks. I come in from a shift and can't wait to forget all about it. But you're never away. It's always going on in your mind, even when you're enjoying yourself. I wish I was more like you. Years of practice, said Cecilia, ignoring the growing urge to shout at the girl, at her idiocy for mistaking chronic insecurity for something to be proud of. And besides, you're perfect as you are, Tunks. Besides, you wouldn't want to be a mole now, would you? I'm part mole, Cecilia, Tunks said, reprovingly. Sometimes I think I wouldn't be as foolish if I were. She sat back down on her own bed and, taking up a pillow, hugged it tightly. Cecilia sat next to her, noticing the music change to a dance below them, and she smiled comfortingly at Tunks. Would you like me to stay? She asked eventually. No. Go and enjoy the party. I won't be long. Just till I get this out of my system. Once Cecilia had closed Tunks's bedroom door, eliminating most of the light from the room save a small strip by her feet, she leaned against the door in the darkness and clenched her fists. Stupid, stupid. She rebuked herself sternly, throwing her arms down sharply by her sides. Why had she been so stupid as to let herself be talked into coming here tonight? In this stupid, but gorgeous dress? To get involved with these people as if they were like her? How could she be so two-faced to console the girl when deep inside she felt, no. Don't think it. Cecilia's mind raced and she looked down the landing towards the music that was coming up from the living room. This place so like her world. The social atmosphere tonight, like a work Christmas party. And she'd fallen for it like it was natural. Why? How come she had been so eager to accept the position in the first place, so quickly? She looked up towards the stairs that led to the second floor. Had Tim really screwed her up in the mind that badly? Well, I came here to do a job, not to get involved with the lives of these people, she told herself firmly as she strode towards the stairs. Tomorrow I'll be home, and I can sort myself out. Sort out my priorities, see the important people in my life. Taking the first two, Cecilia hoisted up the skirt of her dress so she didn't trip over it on the stairs and was glad she could remember where Sirius's study was. Therapeutic, that's what it had been, she thought as she got to the top of the stairs. Terrifying and demanding, definitely. But the time had come to take a step back and concentrate on what she had been tasked to do, and that was to help Severus with the potion. And she would be able to do that when she had got the magic out of her system. Severus. Getting to the top of the stairs, Cecilia crept along the landing towards where she remembered the study to be. Surely he would have mentioned that he had to go if he knew. So probably he didn't know. Sirius knew though, and he was the last person Severus would have told. Cecilia stopped as she got to the door. Placing her hand on the handle, she began to turn it, steeling her mind to the work she must do. The study was still lit, with oil lamps on the walls, as it had been 2 weeks ago when she had looked at the books in here then. Cecilia blinked as she looked around at the shelves, trying to make sense of where she needed to continue from. All these books, she thought. There had to be something in these, some answers more than she had found before. Carefully lifting a book off the shelf, carefully looking down the contents list randomly for anything that might be relevant to the loose ends that she had exposed at the edge of her research, Lali.JosephBlack.Energy, Light, Magic.Oswald.T.Reciprocator. Once she had repeated the process on the 14th book, Cecilia replaced it back on the shelf, sighing at her own ineffective process. Was there anything here at all that was going to be useful? Her eye rested on the spine of another book, Ye Old Magic. Maybe this one would have some of the answers. She raised her hand to the book, then stopped. Perhaps she could ask Sirius if she could come here tomorrow, to look at his books. If she had her notes, she could go over them again. At least she had remembered to pack them. Glancing from the book, she thought about Tunks, sitting in her room alone. Maybe she wasn't She wasn't the kind of character who would sit round feeling sorry for herself. Tunks was probably downstairs right now, dancing with Remus and enjoying herself. Which is where you should be, having fun, she scolded herself. There's nothing you can do here now, tonight. It's Christmas Eve, after all. Ignoring the books and stepping back out onto the landing and closing the study door behind her, Cecilia turned in the darkness in the direction of the stairs and gasped when she felt a hand on hers. Cecilia, she heard Sirius say near her ear. And where have you been? She turned quickly in the direction of his voice. Sirius, she exclaimed. You scared me. I was just in the study, looking at my books again, he said, and, as the darkness on the landing faded, Cecilia saw Sirius smiling at her, wand in hand. You only had to ask, he continued. Find anything interesting? Cecilia shook her head. I assumed you wouldn't mind, she said, glancing down at her hand, still on the doorknob with Sirius's still on hers. I haven't got my notes, so I thought I'd ask you to look tomorrow, if that would be okay. I thought you were leaving tomorrow? Well, before I leave, she clarified. If that's okay with you, she added, in a mock deferential tone. We could look now, said Sirius, his eyes shimmering in the dim lamplight. Tell me what you're looking for and perhaps we could save you some time. Without waiting for her to reply, he turned her hand on the knob and ushered her through the study door, his left hand on her back. Okay, where'll we start? Said Cecilia, looking round the study, before turning back to Sirius. Thank you so much, it'll be so dash. Before she could finish the sentence, either aloud or in her mind, Sirius took a step towards her. Without saying anything, he looked straight into her eyes, the darkness therein making Cecilia gasp. She opened her mouth to speak as he pulled her closer to him, and she realized she was trembling. Don't say anything, Sirius said softly. Since you walked through the door this evening I haven't been able to think of anything else. Cecilia felt his hand on her back as he kissed her firmly but softly on the lips, and her mind, hitherto filled with thoughts of her research, was overwhelmed with the feelings that she had tried to deny this evening and over the last few months. As quickly as he had kissed her, Sirius now broke off and looked at her. Brushing her cheek with the back of his hand, he smiled softly as Cecilia looked into his eyes. "I've been wanting to do that since your birthday," he said, trailing his hand from her cheek to her chin, placing her thumb onto the dimple on her chin and moving down her lower jaw. Without warning, he kissed her again, this time much deeper, and with more passion, causing Cecilia to gasp at the intensity which made her take a step back to keep her balance. Sirius stepped towards her too, and another, still kissing her until her back was against the cerulean wallpaper of the study wall. Cecilia kissed him back now, her willpower trying to gain her attention from the corner of her subconscious, but being prevented from building up strength because of the pincer movement being expertly performed by her passion and desire. And Sirius continued as kiss her. His hand on her hip. She gasped as he worked his hand down her leg. Finding the hem of her dress. As he kissed her with more passion, Cecilia felt her heart beating much faster, and a feeling creep over her as Sirius worked his hand up her bare leg. Images filling her mind. Cecilia pulled apart from their embrace, looking down at the floor as a feeling of guilt washed over her. "Sorry," she said, looking at Sirius. His eyes, filled momentarily with confusion, became stormy dark pools again, and before Cecilia could take the steps that her mind was willing her to take towards the door and through it, Sirius had pushed her back against the wall again, this time entangling his fingers into her hair as he kissed her more passionately now than Cecilia could ever have imagined. There was no denying that it felt good. Instinctively, Cecilia returned Sirius's kiss, and as he worked his hand up from her back, this time, up her ribcage, stopping at the top of the ruching and tracing his hand along her halter neck, he pressed her more firmly against the wall. But another feeling, uncomfortable and perturbed, pricked her mind. The feeling was good, in itself. But why was this so wrong? And she felt Sirius's hip knock against hers. The response between them made it clear what his intentions were, and what sprang to her conscious were images from Minerva's memory of Sirius. Of James. Lily. Remus. Why was she thinking of Remus Lupin as Sirius Black was kissing her so passionately? "Stop," she gasped, breaking from his firm grip again and fighting all thoughts of Remus from her mind, but Sirius didn't. His hands continued to touch her, and he continued to hold her between his body and the wall. Desperately, Cecilia pushed him away, ducking under his arm, but he caught her left hand and swung her back, the tendons in her arm bending painfully. "You want it, Cecilia Frobisher, you know you do." His dark eyes flashed as he pulled her closer to him as he hissed in her direction. Despite herself, Cecilia shivered at his touch again, and she felt her heart racing in her chest. He was right. She did want it. She could so easily give in to this. But it would be wrong. And why did he want her so badly? She wasn't his type. "Leave me alone, Sirius," Cecilia said loudly, trying to wrestle her arm from his grip, but Sirius merely grinned and pulled her arm roughly towards him. "Why?" He looked her up and down as he spoke, and Cecilia shivered again, more from an increasing feeling of fear now, rather than pleasure. "We're just getting started," Sirius added, looking into her eyes and tracing his left hand onto her collarbone. Cecilia looked from his hand back to his eyes. "Please, Sirius, no," she insisted sharply. "Look, Idash. Why do you think you're so high and mighty?" Sirius snapped, stepping away from her. "You come here, dressed like that." He gestured his hand towards her. "And you tell me no?" Cecilia stepped towards the door, looking in the direction of the furious Sirius. "Look," Cecilia tried again, opening the study door with her left hand. "Sirius. I don't think that. This is just too fast," she added lamely. Sirius's eyes narrowed as the study door swung open on its hinges. You preach about melon wizard similarities, but when it comes down to it, do you think yourself so different not to go with a wizard? Cecilia could feel her mouth open, recalling the conversation she had had with Tunks all those weeks ago, and felt her face begin to blush. As I am here on order business, and I was invited by yourself because of that to the party, I don't think you really have any call to ask me that, replied Cecilia, an element of rebukeful teacher entering her tone. But before I rejoin my colleagues, if you insist on an answer, then I tell you now that there is not one wizard I would, as you so tastefully put it, go with. Turning on her heel, Cecilia made for the open door, but Sirius was too quick for her, and slammed it shut. Cecilia felt herself jump back in shock, and looked quickly at Sirius, who was standing next to her. That's a lie. I can see it in your face, Cecilia. His words were cold now, blowing like a winter wind in her face as Sirius looked her up and down, taking in her dress, figure and shoes. Cecilia looked away and took a step back, noticing a look of desire pass over his features. She put her hand on the doorknob and opened the door again, stepping through into the dark landing and leaving Sirius inside the study. Just as Cecilia was about to take a step, Sirius grabbed her wrist, pulling her back inside. She winced at the pain, as he took a few steps towards her, throwing the door shut again. You tease, hissed Sirius, looking Cecilia up and down, taking in her hair, her dress, his eyes lingering momentarily on the brooch Remus had given to her, down to her dress and shoes, and Cecilia shuddered, not from desire anymore, but out of fear. Pathetic really. Now Snivellus isn't here to defend you. Those long nights studying with him have made you crave proper male company. Then again, what you were studying, that's the big question. It must be something worthwhile for you to leap to his defense so readily. Cecilia looked back at Sirius, her mind racing through the options that she now had available. She had spurned his advances and had made him angry. And she could smell a faint tinge of alcohol on his breath too, couldn't she? What had made him desire her so badly? Oh yes, Snivellus' pet puppy, all groomed and ready for the big party. Sirius laughed at his own taunt, as he gripped her wrists tighter. And that was it, wasn't it? What her mind had been trying to tell her a long time ago. Sirius wanted her because he wanted to get at Severus, not because of her. Like when he was 17 years old. How dare you! Exclaimed Cecilia, shaking her hand free and fixing him with an indignant stare. You do know he's not pure blood, hisses Sirius starkly. Do you think I care about that just because you do? Do you think it would shock me? I've known for a very long time, Sirius. She watched his face grow darker, and his eyes shimmering in the light. Snivellus told you? He wouldn't. He spat, stepping towards Cecilia, and she felt her heart beat faster behind her beautiful dress. You're a liar, all of your type are. As he took another step towards her, but this time, Cecilia was too quick. Through the open door she went, throwing off his inaccurate grab of her shoulder. Heart beating quicker again, she scooped up her dress and hurried down the stairs, tripping down the last couple of stairs. In front of her, music permeated up from downstairs, and she paused at the top step, smoothing down her dress and adjusting her bodice, ignoring Sirius's shouts of indignation behind her. Don't you walk away from me! Cecilia heard as she was halfway down the first flight of stairs, and she turned to see Sirius behind her, his face twisted in fury. Cecilia turned back, and below her she could see shadows of people on the floor at the bottom, but before she could hurry towards the safety of others, Sirius grabbed her arm. So arrogant, which is dangerous considering your protector Snivellus is not here to defend you, he spat, his face close to hers. I really pity him, having to put up with a cumbersome baggage like you, he continued, his spirit-tinged breath on her face, but with his plan of selling you to his Death Eater friends for the price of his freedom, I can see how even that would be tolerable. That and anything else you are willing to give him, of course. Cecilia looked back at Sirius. Here she was, halfway down the stairs in his house. An hour ago he had been dancing with her. 15 minutes ago he was trying to tear her clothes off. And now here he was, with a far-fetched story about Snape, who wasn't even here to defend herself. She felt her eyes narrow at the ludicrousness of his suggestion, and scorn filled her mind. "You're sick," she spat back. "Sick in the mind, Sirius? Do you think that I'm going to believe anything you say about Severus, considering your past history?" He loosened his grip and she turned again, picking up the skirt of her dress and walked down a few more steps, fighting out thoughts of Sirius and trying desperately to replace them with those of home, her home. If she asked someone here, they could probably take her tonight. "You don't believe me? I don't believe that you trust a Death Eater like him," he shouted after her. "A mole like you should take all the advice she should get, especially with his past history." And that was the moment. Cecilia would tell herself that she should have turned to her right. Now she had got to the bottom of the stairs, she should have ignored Sirius and rejoined the party. What she shouldn't have done was what she did do. What she shouldn't have done was, "You know, I would trust him 1,000 times over you, Sirius," she shouted back, glancing from the wizards who were chatting and laughing, clearly still enjoying the party. One or two noticed that she was there, and had waved in acknowledgement. "Don't you dare walk away from me, you dim-witted mole." Sirius hurried down the stairs and stood in front of her. Cecilia stopped, backing towards the kitchen door. Why was he behaving like this? As she turned, she saw he had a book. Sirius held up her research book and Cecilia looked between it and Sirius. It was the one from their room. Where Tonks was. Behind her, she noticed that some of the wizards had stopped now. One or two now had noticed she was there. Mr. Weasley, Bill holding a glass of pumpkin juice, Sturgis Podmore caught in mid-conversation with Minerva, looking at her in mid-greeting, who had stopped in astonishment and surprise at the scene between herself and Sirius. "You've no right." Cecilia heard herself croaking, frustration building that a furious Sirius was holding her book so carelessly. As she stared, her face growing redder and more annoyed, he opened it, glancing up from the pages. "It makes interesting reading, mole. Especially your last note, right here." Sirius pointed halfway down the left-hand page where Cecilia had written her shorthand memo about Remus and Lily's DNA. Now more people were turning to look at them, and the gramophone, which, until then, was playing merrily, now en masse, falling silent. "You have no idea what you're up against," he continued, shaking the book in her direction. "Energy, light and magic? These are people you are dealing with here." "I have every idea, Sirius," Cecilia replied quickly, keeping her voice as calm as she could. "Why do you think I'm still here, working with wizards?" She glanced at the Order, who were all looking at her and Sirius now. "Working with you," she added, addressing them. Looking at the Order of the Phoenix now, Cecilia steeled herself to walk towards the wizards. Between her and safety was empty space which she had to cross slowly and courageously. Holding up her skirt, Cecilia took a step, but Sirius stepped in front of her, fixing her with a stare, and Cecilia heard a gasp from behind him and a mutter, which sounded like Molly Weasley saying something to Mr. Weasley. "You are a coward, Cecilia Frobisher. How can you do that to a child? You claim to have Harry's interest at heart, and yet you are willing to use his mother to further your foul work." Cecilia took another step and Sirius raised the book. In his hands he held the last month of her empirical research, the notes that came to her when she was attempting to get to the next step, or bridge a gap. Notes that couldn't be replaced. Cecilia stopped and looked between Sirius's flaring dark eyes and the book. "Why are you doing this, Sirius?" She asked the question without meaning to, and it hung in the air between them, and between her and the rest of the Order, who were still standing silently behind Sirius. From your own admission this very evening the universal link is not valid. I make no apology for ensuring the safety of my godson. That no harm comes to him. It is dangerous work that you do, Mrs. Frobisher. His eyes glinted now, and Cecilia realized where she had seen the look before. Last time, she was lying on the kitchen floor and Sirius was choking her. You don't think I know that? Cecilia's voice quavered as she spoke. It's what your community has asked for, what you voted for, unless I'm very much mistaken. You talk as if we are equal. Well, if that is so, it is because of how I'm treated, Sirius. All of these people here, Cecilia retorted, gesturing to the Order. All have welcomed me, and treated me as such. Tonks. She looked at Tonks, standing behind Minerva. Professor Dumbledore ... Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Remus. Harry. At the mention of his name, Cecilia noticed Sirius flinch, as if an electric shock had passed through him. If his eyes betrayed his inner fury before, it was nothing to the expression on Sirius's face now. Cecilia glanced at the Order again, and as one, they were now looking at her. Don't you dare mention his name with your filthy mouth, screamed Sirius, almost off the floor with rage. You and Snivellus, you just keep on and on with this idiocy, whatever cost. And I am not going to let the cost be Harry. Sirius took a few steps towards Cecilia again, and instinctively she stepped back until she felt the wood of the kitchen door against her back. I do believe I've warned you off Harry before, I am sure you remember that, but it seems you don't want to take the hint. Cecilia glanced frantically between the Order and Sirius now. He was clearly out of his mind, fueled by alcohol and his transparent prejudice against moles. She began to tremble as Sirius began to wave her book in her direction. These are the people that treat you as equal? He asked, looking back at the Order. Yet that cannot be so, as they have yet to describe to you what all magic did at Halloween. I already know, replied Cecilia, above the random gasps from the hitherto mute wizards now. Again your shocking information has failed, Sirius. You know, but not the extent. Not the amount of moles that were killed. Not who they were. Not the manner in which the Death Eaters claimed the lives of your kind dash. That's enough, Sirius. Remus had stepped forward out of the crowd, the stunned mass of wizards now chattering amongst themselves as he did so. So, she has you under her spell too, Moony? Sirius glanced over his shoulder and addressed his friend. Metaphorically, of course, but then after the conversation I heard half an hour ago she just can't stop interfering. How are you and my darling cousin anyway? Cruel, thought Cecilia, as she saw Remus glance down, shifting uncomfortably before his friends and colleagues. How could he do this, she thought. It was one thing to attack her, but his best friend? Don't think I don't know what you were going to do with this mole, he continued, waving her book. You think you're helping Lily and James. And Harry, but you're not, Moony. Not with this filthy mole. He jerked his head towards Cecilia as he spoke, and she felt herself looking down, feeling a label of shame being pinned to her beautiful dress through every double helix. Cecilia, it's the only chance we've got. Remus looked back at Sirius, trying to reason with him, against his unreasonable charges. We are so close to this potion, can't you see that this is the best chance we have of getting all of this over with? Sirius turned to Remus, aggression in his stance as he swaggered with defensive accusations. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Moony. And the rest of you. Sirius addressed the other wizards of the Order who were beginning to whisper amongst themselves. After tonight, you won't be able to carry out your plan. He turned to look at Remus, nor yours, of taking a piece of Lily, so she can study. Sirius swung round, a look of pure hatred in his expression before looking back to his friend. Unlike you, I know where my loyalties lie, Remus. I suggest you have a rethink. Forget it, Remus. It's not worth it. Cecilia felt the words sticking in her dry throat, and she took another step towards the wizards, trying to ignore the confusion in her mind now that had been this evening. "How dare you say I'm not worth it, you poisonous little—" Snapping the book closed, Sirius dug inside his robe and pulled out his wand, and Cecilia felt herself shake again, and she looked between it and Sirius's enraged face. "How is it you think yourself better than I? You should know your place." Sirius took a step towards Cecilia. "I should have tried harder in the summer." Cecilia tried desperately to open the kitchen door with the handle, fumbling with the handle which failed to gain her access. Sirius threw the book onto the floor, kicking it across the floor where it landed a few feet from Cecilia. There was nowhere else for her to go as Sirius raised his wand. "You filthy mole." "No." Cecilia felt her mouth open, as if to yell it at Sirius, but no sound came out, and she stood with her back to the kitchen door open-mouthed as he raised his wand. The room was silent as yellow sparks crackled from the end. And with a flick of his wrist, Sirius shot a yellow beam of lightning towards her book, causing it to disintegrate within seconds. Her research. Mere ashes on the carpet. Gone. Rage now spilling out of Cecilia, like a river undimmed and ferocious. Taking a few steps towards Sirius, her temper was lost in a cloud of fury. "I don't care what you think of me, Sirius Black. That can be replaced." Cecilia pointed towards what remained of many hours of hard work, and buoyed by Sirius's shocked expression at her rebuttal, she continued. "I made a promise to continue to work for the Order, and I'm still going to do what I said. You think what you've done makes you better than me?" "We are better than you," he scoffed. "Equal," she spat back. "Expendable," he laughed. "Do you really think that I would help you? That I hadn't removed anything in this house that would remind me of my family so that you could find? I always intended to stop you. Everything I've ever done has been to prevent you from continuing. And your strong will has made it come to this." "Excuse me," retorted Cecilia, "I really must be going. I have a long overdue appointment in the real world, and I am sure that one of these more courteous people will escort me there." To her surprise, when she stepped forward this time, Sirius didn't get in her way. Not only that, he bowed his head as she passed, and slowly, Cecilia walked across the floor towards the rest of the Order. She saw the faces of the other wizards, all fixed in masks of horror, shock and dismay, and Cecilia shut out all thoughts, other than that which was forcing her to walk towards them without turning round. A loud crack behind her brought Cecilia to a standstill. With every ounce of willpower she continued to look at the wizards in front of her, refusing to turn around. "Kreacher," she heard Sirius say. "Are you prepared?" Cecilia spun round to see him crouching down to speak to the elf, who was hopping from one foot to another and staring glassy-eyed at Cecilia. "Prepared for what?" Remus addressed the elf now in quiet, but steady tones. "The blood deed," it croaked happily, looking at its master. "Kreacher's blood deed that has been passed down to him from his father." "Which is what, Kreacher?" asked Minerva McGonagall, narrowing her eyes towards Sirius, and Cecilia looked at her, noticing that Tonks, who was standing behind her, was white as a sheet, and Cecilia felt as if a bucket of ice was being slowly poured down her back. "Master only has to say the word, and it will be done. The mole will be dead." He looked menacingly at Cecilia as she felt as if she had been slapped in the face. Immobilis. Arthur Weasley stepped forward, thrusting his wand out past Cecilia, and she saw the elf stop mid-jump, hanging in the air as if he had been frozen. "Sirius, why are you doing this?" he shouted, wand still held out as Sirius jumped away from his house elf. "Mistborn!" screamed Sirius towards Cecilia, who had turned to face him, yellow light crackling on wand. Around her the wizards behind her began to talk, all at once, as if the hitherto inanimate, mute spectators had suddenly been woken up. "It's what every wizard thinks about each mole, deep down. And I'm just being true to my kind. he added, looking defensively at the order. "I think you need to shut up now," said Remus, his voice still steady, and he stood with his wand raised, next to Mr. Weasley. Sirius took a step towards Remus, sparks still crackling. "Moony, I wouldn't," growled Sirius starkly. "Someone stop them, for pity's sake," shouted Molly, from the front. "Albus! Minerva! This is getting beyond a joke. Sirius Black, lower your wand." Cecilia turned at the sound of the voice behind them. She had heard it before, though she couldn't place it. Behind her, Dumbledore stepped out and glided between Sirius and Remus. Dumbledore, thought Cecilia, her mind full of random thoughts. Like in Minerva's memory. The tone that would make anyone feel as if they were 5 years old. And Cecilia's heart began to beat faster as wizards passed by her, bustling and shouting. When she realized she wasn't actually going to die, Cecilia looked back towards the staircase. Without looking back, refusing to look at anyone behind her, Cecilia rushed back upstairs to Tunks's room, slamming the door behind her,